I wanted to first check in with you about your project, your local Indigenous history project. I sent you an email with some sources. We can also talk about it a little bit on Thursday, but I know a lot of you are working on it now. It is going to be a challenge to find those sources that present the history from the Indigenous perspective. That's the most important thing that you should do, is not start your history with the moment of European contact and just talk about colonization, right? So you want to make sure that you are thinking a lot about presenting history much more from an Indigenous perspective. If you have questions about that, maybe we can talk about it a little bit on Thursday, but you can also definitely email me for suggestions of places to look. I also highly recommend talking to Jody Devine at the library. That's the librarian that I connected with you with on email. She knows about this assignment. I think she might have already worked with somebody. Garrett, were you telling me that you worked with somebody at the library already?
I don't know if it was specifically, but yeah, I did the online chat and they like helped me find some sources on EBSCO.
Okay, good. So,
but like you said, my tribe was no longer existent, so we couldn't.
Right. So you have to dig a little deeper. It's going to be a little bit more tricky. So anyway, get on that. Make sure that you check in with me if you have any questions. And that's due the 28th, so next Thursday. Wow, time's flying, right? Hope you guys are all doing well. Hope everybody's taking care and your families are well. We are really lucky today because we have a great guest speaker, Lorenz Spears. She is the executive director of Tamaquag Museum. She's also a really good friend of mine. We've been friends for a long time, I think, like maybe 10 years now almost, something like that.
Easy.
She has loads of accomplishments, and I won't even begin to try to talk about them all, but I will tell you that she has an undergraduate degree from University of Rhode Island, a master's degree from the University of New England, and an honorary doctorate as of, was it 2017, I think you got that, from URI. She's the winner of the Tom Roberts Prize for Achievement in the Humanities. And she was named one of the extraordinary women in education in 2010. She is extraordinary, it's true. But as I said, she's the executive director of Tamaquag Museum, and she's also was the founder of Nuituan School, which was a really amazing institution, K-8 school that ran from 2003 to 2010 in Exeter, Rhode Island, and was focused on Indigenous educational practices. A really wonderful school. She's also been a two-term tribal councilwoman of the Narragansett Indian tribe, and she's on the board of the Rhode Island State Council of the Arts, and so many other things that I won't mention here. But we're really lucky to have her, and she comes at a great moment in our syllabus because we've just talked about colonization and decolonization. We're moving into talking about Indigenous epistemologies, or ways of knowing Indigenous sciences. And so she fits exactly into the conversations that we've already been having about museum representation, about decolonizing practices, and especially about ways of knowing, right? Different ways of knowing things. We've talked a lot about science and different kinds of science, and how science and history and the kinds of knowledge that we have is not neutral, right? It's never objective or just neutral, the kind of Western knowledges that we take for granted. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Lorenz Spears.
Askawit Kwasin, Natasawis Makasini Pashao at Nahai Gansik, Natasawis Lorenz Spears at English at Ni Nahai Gansik Nehantik, Kanupiam at Aki at Nahai Gansik. So what I said to you in my language was hello. My traditional name is Makasini Pashao. Most people call me by my sort of formal Eurocentric name, which is Loren Spears. And I am Narragansett Niantic, and I welcomed you to the homelands of the Narragansett people. And I will try to weave in some of the things that you're also working and learning about in this presentation. So just looking at the first image that's on the slide presentation, it is a cairn, which is a modern cairn made by Native youth, one of which graduated from Nuitwan School, another that they're both college age now. One's a college student at College Unbound. And they had been interns at Tamaquag Museum. One of the things that we do is try to create opportunities for Native youth and Native peoples in this current world that we live in, that is, you know, the 21st century, and unfortunately Indigenous people are still the most impoverished people within our own homeland, and impoverished in the Western capitalism perspective versus in cultural knowledge and ways of being. That quote at the bottom is not just a quote, it's an ideology. We are the earth. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. And it's something that when we talk about understanding our place in this world, understanding our lifeways, our culture, our traditions, our language, everything is connected to this land, and to the cycles of the seasons and the cycles of the earth. And in this cairn, which is part of a science way of knowing, there's many what people are terming ceremonial landscapes in the forested areas, where they're finding cairns and other kinds of ceremonial markers that have been made by our ancestors in the past, some of which align with the celestials that mark the equinoxes, the summer and the winter equinox, and the spring and the fall equinox, and are all aligned. People have done the modern day math to apply to these things, but these are science and knowledges that have been in our culture and communities for millennia and have been passed down. In the modern world, post European contact, the idea of masonry came to be a thing that was very or is very prevalent within the Native community. And I often push back that it was something that we had a lot of knowledge about before it became a construct for an economy. It was something that we were already doing in making cairns and making mockers and making these ceremonial landscapes out of stone, but also making stone tools and stone implements. So we had this relationship with stone. There's a really great film if you want to know more about that. It's called Stories in Stone. It's by Mock Levitt, and he partnered with lots of people within the Indigenous community to tell that story. It comes on PBS now and again. I think I recorded it recently. We have it here at the museum as well on DVD maybe. So I just wanted you to kind of put yourself in that place. If you want to see this cairn in person, all you got to do is go to the Roger Williams National Memorial in downtown Providence on North Main Street. We did a partnership with them, along with a lot of other institutions, and there's only like 3 or 4 that their art installation lasted and is still there. And so you can see this, and they represented their cultural knowledge in the images that they put there. Why is it not letting me cursor forward? Well, let me see if I pull out the clicker, if that'll make a difference, if it will decide if it cares. It does not, for some reason, want to let me flip forward. I'll pretend I'm actually out in the field and have to have my clicker, because for some reason it's not letting me arrow forward, and it's not letting me use my mouse pad.
Clicker's not working. Maybe try coming out of full screen. Would that make it?
The only way I know how to go out of full screen is if I stop the actual. Oh, wait a minute. What is this? That is very weird.
Oh, that's a different slideshow.
Yeah, that was confusing me. Let me close that. Oh,
There you go.
Weird. Okay, so Nukasaki, Mother Earth. And I think that that's another thing that sometimes today might seem a little cliche that people say, but again, it's about ideology and the way that people look at the world. And the reality is we look at that as the Earth Mother. It's everything that is humanity today is connected to the earth and the cycles of life, and everything that we need is in this. Our creation story that even was documented way back when in Roger Williams' Key into the Language. We did a new edition, but he documented our, his way of saying it, our creation story. But the reality is our creation story is that we literally come up out of the clay in the, what some people might call the mud, and we're formed into the beings that we are as the Nahai people, and that we're literally from this land, made of this land, and that everything about us ebbs and flows from this place. When people learn about quote unquote Native Americans, American Indians, indigenous peoples, First Nations, First Peoples, they kind of clump us into this one category. I likened it to saying, the same if they do Hispanic. It means everybody that in some way speaks Spanish, which is really kind of absurd. But nonetheless, whether you're from Puerto Rico or you're from Brazil, which are not even close to each other, or from Spain, they clump you under that umbrella. Well, the people are not the same, and our stories are not the same, and our lifeways are not the same. Everything that we are comes from this land. So our lifeways, the things you do in your life, the jobs that you have, the food that you wear, the clothes that you make, the resources that you use, the homes that you build, the ceremonies and activities that come out of that, all stems from this place. And so when we say that we come from the land and we are the land, we're literal about that. Our language is steeped into this place. I mean, you're in Rhode Island right now. Even today, our language is steeped in this place, whether that's Weekapaug, Uskapaug, Quanakintog, Woonsocket, Pawtucket, Patuxet, and you just keep going. All of those things are connected to the land. And so when we think of that, we think of it as very literal, and that all our lifeways come from that, and these gifts that are in this land come from those resources. And it's a different way of thinking about land and resources. When colonists came here and we're talking about conquest and colonization, it's about power. Well, first about greed or need, greed for the resources, for the people that have a lot of power, and the people that follow them are often people with need. The people with power have political power, economic power, military power, police power, you name it, they have power. They also feel entitled, and that's another kind of power. They feel entitled to these resources by, Columbus can go someplace, shove a flag in the ground and say, ta-da, that's mine, on behalf of the king and queen in Spain, which gave him the power of resources and weaponry and military or whatever.
Oops, Loren, we've lost your voice. Can you guys hear her?
No, we can't.
Okay, Loren?
I think it's just frozen altogether for her.
Yeah, her video's frozen.
Gonna have to maybe exit out and come back in. I kicked her out, I think.
Oh, she's here.
I'm here. You see me?
Oh, okay.
I hope we're not going to do that a lot.
I hope so too. You got to share your screen again. We lost your screen.
Okay, let's see. How do I do that again? I can never seem to find it. Oh,
You'll get really good at this. Believe me. You do it a few times.
Okay. Every time I do this though, I don't seem to share the screen. Where's the share the screen button?
You should see it at the bottom. The green button.
What happens is once my screen is showing, let's see. It's like this, once I do this, then my screen is hidden. It's like I can't do both at the same time.
You can shrink the pane that has all the people in it. Just slide it down and shrink it.
Well, what keeps happening is literally when I try to put my screen, my PowerPoint on full, like to play from the start, it automatically goes to share screen. Well, let's see what happens here. Let's do it like this and see what happens. Do that first. Okay, I see what happens. I have to do the sharing first and then make it big. Okay. Okay. So what I was saying is greed and need, power, entitlement, fear and hate. And one of the last things that you can think about when you think about conquest and colonization is censorship. And that is not having voice, a voice in the political process, voice in access to the economy, voice in the media, voice in any way possible. So that's just a quick aside, because if I get too far off on that, we'll spend another hour there. So thinking quickly about the land and indigenous ways of being, it's very cyclical. You know, we think of circles and cycles as being really important, and it's because when you live in harmony with the land, you literally live in that sequence of what's available. If you think about just even the hardships we're having right now and the fact that the stores are kind of empty, it's because we're not living within the means of what's available in this ecosystem. We're getting things from clear across the world and across the country to support that that food economy that we currently have, which is why a lot of places today are talking about food sovereignty, not just indigenous communities, but communities that have food deserts and looking at food justice in a variety of ways. Well, when you think about living in relationship with the land, you're taking the things as they come in each season, in each resource. And I show not just the food resources, but also the things that you make from those foods. So whether you're talking about the summertime and the resources along the salt waters, or the fall where you're talking about when you're going a little more inland again and capturing all these things, there's not just the food that you use, but the resources that you have, whether that's dyes and medicines and materials where you can make clothing, baskets, the things that you need in your life, tools, etc. So all of these kinds of things are really, really important in thinking about that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these sections. I'm just going to whip through them, but you know, showing you each season and the resources that are there. But when I told you that the ceremony comes from the land as well, the ceremonies here are not the same ceremonies as my niece-in-law, who married my eldest nephew, who she's Dene, or what you might know as Navajo. She is from the desert Southwest. We are Eastern Woodland coastal people. Our ceremonies and their ceremonies are not the same, because your ceremonies stem from the resources in your ecosystem. When she got married, she came out here for school and she met my nephew here. And when they got married here. So her family all came out, and my brother and sister-in-law, they were throwing out, what do they say, the nines, the big meals. We were having lobster and crab and, chowder and, smoked fish and all kinds of seafood and what have you. And they were going, tastes like salt. Like they didn't like it. They had never had it before. When they had my eldest great niece, their eldest daughter Najoni's first birthday, they came out and they cooked mutton like mutton is really, really a big thing, so much so that they fight over the eyes as a delicacy. And we're like, ew. And they look
Do
at
you
a
guys know?
lobster
You
and
guys,
go,
does everybody
ew.
know what mutton is? It's like it's an older, it's a sheep, not instead of lamb, it's a sheep, right? So
Yeah,
if you didn't know
exactly.
what mutton was.
And that's not something we eat here on the East Coast in general as a rule. And it was certainly something we weren't, something common for us. So the point of sharing those stories is that the foods and the ceremonies and the lifeways come from that ecosystem and that environment. And that's true for us. So whether we're celebrating a strawberry Thanksgiving or a maple sugar Thanksgiving or the green corn Thanksgiving, those are all harvests that are in our ecosystem and are things that are gathering. And so everything comes from that. Your games come from your ecosystem, your socialization, everything. So as I was mentioning, 13 Thanksgivings showing that harvest. We have 13, one for each new moon of the year. Sometimes today, the moon and the Thanksgiving are called the same thing, but in our history, sometimes the moon was something different and what the Thanksgiving was called was something different. So, so the maple sugar Thanksgiving is an event and a ceremony that you're giving thanks for the maple, but that time period is the time of the big winds. March is usually considered very windy, so that doesn't necessarily have the same name. But in our culture, those 13 Thanksgivings is 13 ways in which we're giving thanks for the harvests and the gifts from the Creator. So when we're thinking about ideological view, sort of Western ideologies are, first off, are very linear versus cyclical. Western ideologies include sort of linear mathematics and strict measurement and product of thought, and that things are independent. Like you think about yourself, you don't think about the group necessarily. It's more singular in its focus as opposed to more well, if you think about the economy, when you think about capitalism is about individuals gaining wealth, and in a traditional ideology, it's about having enough for the whole community. And even in Roger Williams, he speaks to the fact that we talk about a Nakomo, and part of a Nakomo, one, it's a traditional Thanksgiving, but it's also known as a giveaway. And it's not a giveaway in the way that we think of Christmas, where I give you a gift, you give me a gift, and we all are happy in that way. It's literally, I'm giving away until what Roger Williams even thought of was, and gave away more than I actually had. He called it giving away more than their means. And it's a cultural norm. We even talk about it today. We talk about giving it until it hurts. Like if you're giving something and it didn't really hurt you to give it, then it really wasn't the level of gift that a Nakomo should have. And so that's a different way of thinking about it. There's an independent construct versus an interdependent construct, that we're all interconnected and we're all one, and that what one does affects the other. And it's the idea, even when you think about environmental, like people often in this modern world think, well, what I do doesn't really matter, as opposed to thinking about, those indigenous people living deep in the Amazon that often are talked about on the news, they're being affected by our air pollution, they're being affected by our water pollution, they're being affected by the plastics that are all floating into their ecosystem. And they are probably becoming ill with things that they don't know where it's coming from. The soil pollutants and the destruction, never mind the overt things that come. These are the sort of things that are just in our world ecosystem, if you will, that are going around. So, the idea of Western ideologies and Western science does not incorporate spirituality, and traditional sciences incorporate spirituality. There's ideas of constants and regulars and law. Traditional ideologies look at it through a livingness. You know, our science is based in this world and in this earth and in the life that we do. It has a sacredness to it. There's soul and spirituality and energy that is incorporated into the idea of science, and everything is interconnected. There's relationships, it's culture. It's a broad view versus in a broad perspective. There's networks and patterns and interconnectivity. Things are animate, you know, as opposed to inanimate. You know, a lot of times when people think of science, they don't think of all the things as living. So for an example, in our language, back to how things are all connected, in our language, anakwasag means stars, and it's actually a living thing. In a Western way of thinking, stars are not living. There's plenty of other examples of that where our language has things that in Western ideologies, they're not considered living. But when you think about a star or the sun, it gives you this heat, it gives you this light, it has this energy around it. And so it's considered living. And then there's a constant change in the science. There's a really good thing, if you're really interested in digging a little deeper in this, there's a couple of things you might want to think about. One, there's this really great book called Power and Place, Indian Education in America, but it talks a lot about science in this. And it was interesting because when I was writing up the curriculum for Nuituan School, to become a school, you have to write the whole school curriculum. And I didn't really spell out environmental education in that curriculum initially. And it turns out that I had an indigenous way of knowing. Like, I'm like, you can't talk about Native history, culture, you know, without including environmental knowledge, something that we call TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge. You can't do one without the other. There's no such thing as being an indigenous person and not being directly connected with the land and its resources, the gifts that the Creator has provided, and how they all relate to each other. So I, like, with my own, even though I was born in the 20th century, with my own indigenous knowledge base, I didn't understand that Western people didn't understand that environmental knowledge was intrinsic in being indigenous and being Native American or American Indian, whatever term you want to use. They didn't understand that. And I kept coming, in the first like 6 months or so, I kept coming up against these people that just didn't understand that. So we had to explicitly write it out that we were going to be doing that. Even as a museum, we have to explicitly express that we're talking about environmental knowledge. I always find it really bizarre, personally. Like, every talk I've ever told is environmental. You can't talk about Native history, culture, and the arts and not connect to it. It just is automatically, intrinsically there. And so this is what we're talking about with that interconnectivity and that web of it. You can't isolate it out over here. And modern Western science likes to isolate things out and go into this one little thing and just focus in there. But yet all these other things are connected to it. And so we really think about it in a different kind of way. There's another place that you might be interested in. It's called Native Ways of Knowing. And it's a science curriculum out of, where was I? I was in Dunseith, North Dakota at the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Community College, and they've done this whole Native program there. I've actually visited there. It was pretty cool. So that's another thing to think about. So one of the things that we talk about in science is that science isn't just the science, and that it's also the stories, and that the stories are created and connected to the science and telling why things are the way that they are. You know, it's like when we tell the story about maple and maple sugaring, that, you know, it's about lessons that need to be learned as to why when we harvest this, it's a lot of hard work in order to get that little bit of maple syrup. When you go to the store and you're like, why does this cost $16? It's because it took 26 or 30 gallons of Wakoni neep, or sweet water as we call it, to make that 1 gallon of maple syrup. And so there's lessons to be learned in the process. Like all of these things are sciences. I mean, our ancestors were creating these science methodologies on harvesting and collecting and processing. I mean, I'll give an example. One of the things that we did with Nuituan students is we harvested acorns. My son decided we're going to harvest them this year because we might need it with COVID-19 going on. But literally, our ancestors knew that you know, acorns here are not edible unless you process them. And so you put them in a woven sack, another type of science and math that's happening, and you put them in the brook or the river and you let the water run over them for a few weeks, a month or so, and it leaches out the tannic acid. Today, we might know the term tannic acid. I'm sure we had some other term for that bitter taste that was there. And then once you did that, you dried them by laying them out on mats that again were woven, another type of science, and you then of course cracked them open and pounded them with a mortar and a pestle, and you made the food. And of course, food is another type of science, cooking and chemistry and things like that. But our ancestors knew all these things, and all these stories helped us know the lessons around the science. You know, indigenous ideologies and epistemologies is all about holistic approach. There's literally no term in our language for science, philosophy, psychology, or art. Art, I point that out because people are like, of course there's native art, but I often tell people, if you want to work with native artists, you have to understand they didn't come to the idea of being an artist from an educational, going to school, I'm going to be an artist perspective, or even from a hobby perspective. They came at it from a cultural knowledge perspective. So they learn these things because, including myself, because I'm an indigenous person. I did not give myself a resume as an artist until I was 40 years old. I'm 53 now. I had over 2 pages full of arts knowledge, and now it's more like 4 pages. And it's because it's what you do, it's who you are, it's part of your being. So the holistic, the Pawa, which is that word there, led the ceremony, and the Pawa is the medicine person or the spiritual healer. So the medicine person is a doctor or a nurse or a medical practitioner, and a spiritual leader like your priest or your minister or what have you, from whatever faith you're calling. In our culture, we wove those 2 things together because you need both. You need spiritual healing in order to have bodily healing. So it's kind of like a phrase like mind, body, spirit. Those all go together in order to be truly well. And so it's a holistic approach. You know, our ceremonies are tied into the seasons of the harvest and of hunting, of gathering. It's the rites of passage, going from a child to an adult. It's from birth, it's death, it's marriage. You know, I remember when someone commented, so one of our cultural norms and beliefs is that corn is a fertility symbol, right? And so sometimes people, when a child is born, they'll either put corn kernels or corn pollen in with the baby. And I had someone comment to me once about how absurd in their mind that was. And I said to them, I said, well, first off, it's symbolic because corn, when it was brought to us, allowed the communities to flourish and have enough food through the longest of winters, because corn is, you know, especially we're talking about flint corn here that you make cornmeal with. That is something that's really, really important to our communities and important to our cultural knowledge and sustains us. And so the idea of corn and fertility comes together because that's what made us strong. It's what made us bigger, what made us healthy in the long winter months. You know, we're not talking about a day where you can go on Amazon and order what you want. It's you know, you had to live within that cycle. And so all of these ceremonies have these components that are interrelated to our food systems and to our sciences, but also incorporate the arts, what people call the arts today: music, dance, storytelling. So native science is all of these things: metaphysics, philosophy, art, architecture, technology, agriculture, astronomy, hunting, fishing, geology, biology, botany, animal husbandry, farming, geography, medicine, psychology, physiology, human experience, spirituality, and ceremony. I gave this presentation, or a different version of it, to some scientists. I was partnering with an institution that was going to be doing a summer program around science, but with Native students, college students from across the country. And I had one scientist so upset. He's a grown man. He literally put his hoodie over his head and was like having a meltdown. And he was getting so frustrated because to him, none of this made any sense. And that none of this idea of indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing and views of the world and the views of science, none of it made any sense to him. And he was really struggling with it. And he was pushing against what I was saying. And he was really having a difficult time. And so finally I said to him, the whole point of me being there was because they were going to have students that were going to be in their class that were going to come from different ideological perspectives, and for them to be open-minded to that. And they were getting so frustrated because the thought was, well, was I not supposed to teach the science that I'm supposed to teach the way that I know how to teach it? And finally, I said to the group, I said, well, think about how you're feeling right now, how frustrated and perplexed, and in some cases angry you were feeling, and misunderstood, and the list went on how these people were feeling. I said, that's how students that come to your classrooms feel when their understanding of the world is completely different from your perspective and the way that you present it. And that was most of the people in the room that were feeling some anxiety and stress sort of took a breath and started to feel. The one that was the most upset, it probably took him a while to get through that, because he was so his mind was, if you could have, extremes, one hand over here and one hand over here as the extremes of Western ideologies and indigenous ways of knowing, he was completely at the farthest end. And so it was like blowing his absolute mind. Like everything he knew had just been thrown out the water for him. Based on what I was saying. And so that is what I was trying to get them to see, that for students, sometimes you're telling them everything that doesn't make any sense to them either, in the way that they understand the world. So in thinking about that, I'm giving some examples of in engineering and architecture. This macaque at the bottom, which is a birch bark container, we actually had an engineer do all the mathematical equations that it takes to make that birch bark macaque. So that macaque is used, it has a unique corners. They don't meet like flat. They kind of weave over each other and make a corner that's like double reinforced, is the best way I can say it. They overlap each other. And it was very complex. When I had students, I used that formula sometimes. I couldn't even dream it up now if I wanted to, but I followed the formula, and we had kids actually go through the mathematical process to make that macaque, to understand. And the purpose of doing that was to make people understand that just because we didn't run formulas didn't mean that we weren't thinking scientifically and mathematically. There's all kinds of programs out there. There's a whole like beadworking program, so you're using a loom and you're doing length times width kinds of mathematical things, in the building of the longhouse or the weed tube. When I had students, sometimes in summer camps and sometimes with Nuituan school, sometimes with public schools, we'd have them make a Witu, which is a dome-shaped dwelling, and they would learn the equations for a sphere and then the hemisphere, and do the radius, the circumference, the diameter, you know, the measurements of the air space in the sphere, or in the hemisphere. And that's a lot of math and science that can be applied. But these are, you know, people weren't whipping out mathematical tools to make this longhouse, but or the traditional Witu, or what you may have heard of as a wigwam, but yet they were mathematical. When people were living in them, they were aerodynamic. The way that the fire pits were put was strategic, so that the smoke didn't get inside so much. Matter of fact, we have dances that are called the smoke dance for when you actually got too much smoke in your house or in your longhouse that was for a cultural gathering or something. And the point of it was to push the smoke up and out of the smoke hole, if that happened. So there was lots of engineering and mathematics that was taking place in not only these structures, but in tools that you were making. I'm thinking about flint knapping. And when you think about the fact that we built these homes with stone tools, that you had to harvest the bark and cut the poles, and you had to bend them and understand, you know, having the materials at the right greenness so that they wouldn't snap, and to make it the right density so that it was strong enough to withhold the you know, have you ever been out here in winter? Last couple of years we haven't had a lot of snow, but about 4 years ago we were up to our hips in April with snow. And so if you have that kind of a winter, a home that could withstand that pressure. So there's so much math and science that was taking place. This happens to be a game that also takes a lot of math and science. It's called Snow Snake. And what our ancestors would do is carve a snake out of wood, and you would play the game by shuttling that down a trowel. So first off, you're making a trowel, you're understanding friction and, you know, speed and, you know, velocity and time, and creating, you know, doing all the math that goes with that for you know, those kinds of things. Also, if you're using a snowshoe, you're learning about displaced weight, and I mean, these were things you needed for survival. You didn't make a snowshoe like today. We get a snowshoe because we think it's fun and we'll tromp around in the winter because it's fun. Well, we were doing this for survival's sake. And so when they were making this, you had to be able to displace your weight. So you had to have the size snowshoe that was appropriate to be able to do that. You had to have the weaving just right so that all of that worked. All of these things are using math and science, whether that is beading or weaving, and, you know, the geometry that's taking place, and all of these things as well. Let's see if we can move this over a little bit. Here we go. So there's a bias to the fact that native science is not really science, and that it's not really valid, and it's kind of like in history, oral history is not valid either. Of course, the people that make this decision are the oppressors and the conquerors in the process. Western constructs are valued. Native science and epistemologies and ways of knowing are considered meaningless, or what's the word I'm looking for, or sort of lack value in that they're considered cute, or, you know, like a caricature in thinking about Native people as not being real. Also, their knowing and their knowledge is not real as well. And so we have something, I mentioned this before, we call it TE, I don't know why it says a C, it should say a K, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, sciences as a way of understanding the world, a story of how things happen, It explains the relationships of things. So when we find out how birds got their song in a story, part of that is the science that's being told, as well as the relationship between us and the animal world. It explains all the different relationships that we have, our existence in time and space, and every culture has science. Certain cultures feel that they are more premier than other cultures, and so therefore they don't validate those science knowledges. Reality is they've been utilizing indigenous knowledge all along. It's something like 50% of all the pharmaceuticals stem from indigenous knowledges and plants and materials from the Americas. And the thing is when we use traditional ways of knowing, that doesn't fit the capitalism model. When you have capitalism, you have to control it, you have to own it. So it's the idea of wampum, for example, what people think of as the purple and the white from the quahog shell. And of course, there's the food that's involved in that. There's spirituality that's involved in that. There's cultural knowledge. There's tools and materials that are made from that. That's a whole nother story. But the point is, in Dawnland Voices, this book, there's a really great article in there. There's lots of great stories that connect to science and ways of thinking and ways of knowing in this book, but this one happens to be in the Mashpee Wampanoag section, where, talking about capitalism, a woman patented the word wampum and wants no native person to use it, and was trying to enforce that. Of course it failed, but nonetheless, it's the idea that she had that entitled feeling, and based on the capitalistic society that we lived in, she felt she could own that word and control its use. So those are things that are how they intersect, how things intersect with each other. Oh, I've got this thing kind of in my way now. Oh, there we go. So a sense of place. As I mentioned to you, all indigenous knowledge comes from the place. Our science and our relationships with each other, our knowledge of medicinals, of, you know, food and cooking, of structures and building, of science and nature, are all interwoven in the place that we're from. Nahai Gansek means the people of the small points. We literally are formed from the clay, which, when you think about clay and you think about the interrelationship with the world, clay takes all the elements. You need the soil, if you will, the clay. You need the air to dry it. You need fire to heat it to be permanent. You need temper, which is usually in our community either from the soil again, or in our case from shell and stone bits. And you need so air, water, fire, soil, and then energy, of course, that makes all of that happen, to make, in essence, our being. And that is science in its totality. It took all the elements to make us, the people. So I think that there's lots of other things I can talk about, but do we want to pause there for a moment and see if there's some questions and then lead us into other things? I know we wanted to talk about decolonizing a little bit, and I can probably wrap that into wherever we go with the questions.
Sure, I think that's a good place to take a pause and talk about what you've shown us so far. Anybody have questions for Loren?
So I have one question. So when you talk about science, so I just want to, I'm hoping I'm not making you repeat it again. So science is not really about just like measuring like numbers to see like how far we are from like the moon, etc. So science is more focused on like a not livelihood, but something being alive. But you're not really like worried about like, let's say like the anatomy or physiology of it. if that makes sense.
Well, it's not that you're not, it's just that it's inclusive. Because
Okay.
you know, medicine people were aware of the anatomy and physiology of a people and of an animal. It's not that you're not those things, it's just not those things in isolation. So indigenous
Okay.
ways of knowing is holistic and knowing all about it. If you're learning about, I mean, we had a lot of knowledge of the celestials, as I mentioned at the beginning, about the landscape, actually pointing out that that is mathematical. In order to create those stone markers to connect and have that all line up, when it lines up, the light shines on that space in a way. I mean, but it's also sacred, it's also spiritual, it's all of those things. And I think that the thing that you have to understand about indigenous ways of knowing is it's not one thing or the other thing, it's all of it together.
Okay.
Holistic.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a question about the environmentalism aspect. You talked about the grown adult who pulled the hood over his head. Could you just reiterate to me, what was the fundamental breakdown and understanding that he had about the understanding of environmentalism from a Native American's perspective?
So it wasn't just environmentalism, it was science. And from his perspective as a science professor, he was very linear, very, this is the fact, you know, A plus B equals C, linear. He couldn't understand any of this. And it literally was blowing his mind, because the way that he had learned science was very Western, in that you're focused in on what you're focused in on as science, and you do it in a very linear mathematical construct. And there's no room in his mind for spirituality to be included. There was no room for the idea of that stories tell part of that science. There was no room for even what you're calling environmentalism. Was not something that he would call science. He would call it just very Western, clinical, data in a numbers way, science. That's the only way he could understand science. You know, you have a question and you solve it through these proofs, and that's how he understood science. And we're always pushing back. So for example, archaeology is a science. Archaeology is wrong a lot of the time, but the way that they structure their science, it's based on what they can find and prove. So for example, for many a year, they said Narragansett people didn't eat corn. It was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard in my life. From a Native way of knowing, an oral history and tradition, we have not one but two Thanksgivings that are to do with science. We have, I mean, to do with corn. Not only do we eat corn in a multitude of ways, but on top of that, we have corn in symbolic things like spirituality, as I mentioned to you before, that is representative of corn. You know, there's so much that was connected to corn that it was an absolute absurdity to us. Well, if you want to look at a film called Woven in Time, again, done in partnership with Mark Levitt. He interviewed quite a few people from the Native community for this. It was a partnership with the state Department of Transportation, because they have Site 110, which is down in Narragansett. And the long and short of it, this archaeological site was saved through a partnership between the tribe and the state and the federal government. And in this film, they talk to the fact that the science, archaeology, and oral history are now weaving together, and that they're seeing that they're coming together. That's how the title is Woven in Time, because archaeology only knows what it can know, but that doesn't mean it knows everything. And that science made mistakes along the way, based on what they knew at that time. I mean, today they're even debunking the Bering Strait theory. That's the thing about science, is they can make theories and then they try to back it up with proof. Well, people are biased sometimes in their proof, and groups that are subjugated are often
Oh, Loren, we lost you again. If you can hear us, you're gonna have to join back in. All right, give her a minute. She'll come back, I hope. That was a really good question, John, by the way. I really liked that question, and it made me think a lot about what we were talking about on Thursday. Let me see if she comes back. I see I'm getting a message here. Hang on. There she is.
It's really pouring. So can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. We can't see your screen again, but maybe you don't need it anymore.
Yeah, probably. Well, let me see.
I was just saying that that question that John asked and your answer is so in line with what we were just talking about last week. We were talking a lot about the histories of archaeology and anthropology in the United States and the ways that they were biased and politically influenced and things like that. And we talked a little bit about, you guys remember talking about craniometry and how that was considered a science, right? That's considered a hard science when people are saying, this is scientific fact, we can prove that, you know, there's this hierarchy of the races by looking at the shapes of people's skulls. And that, at that time, we look at it now and we think, well, that's ludicrous and crazy, and why would anybody agree with that? And yet, at that time, that science was considered to be really valid and valuable and important information and objective, right? So we think of science as Western science as objective and neutral, and so this is a good example of it not being true. And I mean, it just reminded me when you're talking about archaeologists saying that Narragansett people didn't eat corn, right? And so we need to have those two ways of knowing coming together. And I think you've given us a lot of examples of
and
that.
it's the idea of going back to the corn, the idea that corn and bean and squash are symbiotic. You know, we know that symbiotic is the science word for it today, but the reality is those sisters, if you will, and the three sisters partnered together. The corn grew up and it allowed the bean someplace to grow. The bean gave nitrogen to the soil. Were we saying it gave nitrogen to the soil? Who knows how our ancestors interpreted that, but they knew that they worked together and that the squash gave it ground covering and kept the moisture in. All of those things. Well, those were all sciences. And just because it wasn't written down in the way that Western science is done, it's often considered less than.
Yeah, good.
Whoops, what happened here?
Thank you.
Are there any other questions right now for Loren?
So there was a couple of other slides if we wanted to quickly
Sure.
go back to them.
Yeah.
This slide is interesting because it's also talking about ideological thinking that is different. Even in science, in many places in the world, it's a very male-dominated thing. And yet in our communities, it was an everybody thing. You know, science wasn't just for those that were elevated in some kind of way. There's also you know, just ideas around perceptions and beliefs and interpretations. And to me, it goes back to conquest, because societies that have been conquered by a conquering, my brain just went on a fog, a colonizing nation, they are subjugated. And in order to subjugate them, part of that is also to debunk and disrespect their science and their ways of knowing as being heathen or
Primitive.
You know, primitive. It's the idea of natural medicinal plant life is witchcraft and all of those kinds of things. Like if you read a book that's written by a non-native person about indigenous people, it's very magical and mystical and all of this kind of thing. If you read the same story, like it can be about the same topic area and it's written by the native person of that community, there's none of that in there. It's just a different way of thinking. And so I think it's a way that they have to take away that knowledge. And so here's a couple of resources at the back of this presentation that might help as you are thinking about these things. Native Science, Natural Law of Independence is really, really good. Red Earth, White Lies by Vine Deloria. Lies My Teacher Told Me. You know, it's looking at a lot of things, not just science. An interesting website you might like is nativetech.org, which also has some interesting things about native science. I mentioned Power in Place. And just a bunch of questions about indigenous culture. Do Indians live in teepees? Which, you know, in reality, obviously not all Indian people lived in teepees, only those that were from the northern plains. But that shape of that building, that structure was very science-based. You live on the northern plains, think Little House on the Prairie, it's winter, the winds are blowing, the blizzard is happening. That conical shaped building meant it withstood those winds, 1. 2, it pushed the heat down where the people were living, 2. And 3, because they were transient people, meaning they were moving and following the herds, they could pack that all up and drag it along with them. 4, plains don't have trees. So those poles that they were dragging along as a travois later, that held up their home, those poles, a lot of ceremony to get them, had to go through a lot of danger to get them, but they also became something that was really, really important as part of their whole structure of their lives. So there was so much science knowledge just in the structure. Every single indigenous home that you look at based on their region and where they're from has a ton of science involved. If you look at indigenous people from the northern regions, like the different Inuit communities, the way that they understand snow, there's like, I don't know, something like 30 terms they have for snow, because there's such a diversity in the type of snow that they have, which is an amazing amount of science. I mean, the people that are living in the desert and understand when those flash floods are going to come and how they can survive off of the plant life that's there. I mean, there's nothing but science in order to live off the land. It's just intrinsically there. Does anyone have another question?
I have a question. On a few slides back, there was like a symbol that was a circle with like 4 quarters in different colors. And this past summer, this past spring, I was in Arizona hiking and I saw that symbol a few times. And I believe I was near like the Hopi tribe and then also like the Navajo. So I was wondering what the symbol means to like your tribe. Yeah. So I was wondering, do they have the same meaning or?
They do, but not exactly. Mm-hmm. So all of those represent the 4 directions: north, south, east, and west. Sometimes they do the above and the below. Sometimes they do the northwest, southwest, northeast, southeast. So it stands for cardinal directions, and usually the colors represent each direction.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So often, white is often the north, the red is the south, the yellow is the east and the west, or vice versa. So that can change. I'm not going to get that. The phone's ringing. So yeah, so it actually appears upside down. Oh, good Lord. But he's got it on, so it's actually upside down right now. or it appears upside down because he's got it on his hand. If he turned his hand up, it would be facing the other direction.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Loren, I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about the philosophy of the museum and just how Tamaquag is different and how you think about representation in your museum. Maybe give a little history of the museum, a tiny bit. It's
Sure.
60 years old, right?
Yeah.
It's 60 plus?
60 plus.
60 plus, yeah.
So yeah, it's 60. We're in the 62nd year of this museum. So it was founded in 1958 by Eva Butler, who was an anthropologist, along with Princess Redwing, who was Narragansett Niantic, and she was the first person voice of that museum in the early days, along with some other indigenous people, Princess Pine Needles and Tall Oak Weedon, he's the only one that's still living today. He's in his 80s. Actually, he's depicted on this picture to the left here. My mother's in the middle,
Yes.
and he's to the left with a hat that says property of Alcatraz on it. And so, yeah, he's a civil rights hero. He actually was with the group that stormed the BIA back in the day during the American Indian movement. Tamaquag Museum, you know, the ultimate goal of the museum is to tell a first-person story of the history, the culture, the environmental, scientific knowledge of indigenous peoples through our programming, you know, everything from tours and offsite programs to workshops and lectures and you know, Thanksgiving programs. So like this image is showing the corn planting moon event that was happening here at Tamaquag Museum. We still do a few. We don't do as many as we once were doing in the last, even since I've been the director. At one point we were doing 6 a year. We're in the middle of doing new facility development, and we don't have, since we closed the school, we don't have a really great indoor space for the winter for large groups. So we've kind of gotten put a couple on hiatus. So the goal of the museum is to represent Indigenous voice through the exhibits, through the programming, through the art, through the collaborations that we do. Matter of fact, the presentation I'm doing in a couple of hours is all about that. And it's literally sharing our stories through this work, but also it's about empowering Indigenous people, hiring Indigenous artists and educators to tell their own story. So we look at this museum as a first-person museum. Most museums are third-person. Some expert talks about a community or group. In this way, we're talking about ourselves. We're sharing our knowledge, and we're sometimes debunking other people's knowledge and pushing back on that. I mean, we get a lot of people that think that they're the expert on our communities when they're not really the expert on our communities. You know, just like anybody, you know more about yourself and your families than someone from outside, and this is true for our community as well. And so through the work that we do, we try to provide resources for teachers and for interested parties in general. If you go to our website at tamaquagmuseum.org, sorry, I was gonna go there because I actually have it open here. So if you look at this, we have a whole educational resource page. It's /resources. You can go to the roadtour.org. This is a project that we did that tells about the history of Indigenous people. You were saying you were doing projects. We start out with Canonicus and Myantonomi, where you can learn a little bit about the intersection between our leaders and Roger Williams. You can learn about Ninigret, Metacomet, who is of course the Wampanoag leader, often known as King Philip. We included Quiapin, who was also a female sachem, Samuel Niles, and the Indian Church. So each one of these, it tells about the people, but also the places like the Indian church. And so you can learn about that, and you can see images of that and things from our archive and collection surrounding that. In our, you can learn about Dawnland Voices. This is also not only the book, but we did a partnership where you can see some things from our archive that was written by Princess Redwing, some music, and not all, this was from her collection, but not all the things in her collection were written by her. This was by Cassius Champlin. This was actually my husband's great-grandfather, I think. Anyhow, so you can learn about that. Oh, this one took us off the page. And it also has our belongings blog. You can learn about land acknowledgements on our belongings blog. You can learn about history of things. So there's educational links to projects that we did partnerships, looking at representation in paintings from RISD. A lot of these paintings are historic paintings that are used in textbooks, but they represent things in inaccurate ways based on the artistic freedom the artist has, and they make it 200 years later, and it's all filled with their bias and misconceptions. Also, Treasures in the Museum tells all about our museum, but also about our archives and our collection. We did partnerships with PBS, so these are short films. This one's like a half an hour long, I think. These are like 5 minutes long, so you can learn about social issues. It's another way to say social justice. I think they could have just done social justice, but they did social issues as the title. Tom McQuagg Museum, because it was our 60th anniversary, where you can learn about us in a nutshell in 5 minutes, and about wampum, which I mentioned to you. There's also trainings that I've done as a consultant to like Boston Children's Museum that are on here. They have them on their website, so we decided to put them on ours. And then public radio, we've done, I'm in this one, but maybe even in number 4, I can't remember. I'm definitely in number 3, but these are all about, it's from an immigration series called Mosaic. And these 4 happen to be about Indigenous people and the idea of immigration or emigration, because we were being pushed from our own homeland, and people were, you know, emigrating to westward, in some ways being pushed that way. And so there's quite a lot of other resources here that will give you some other ideas of resources that you might be interested in to help in your research, depending on your topic areas. Did I tell them enough?
I think so. I think we're at 1 minute. I think we have 1 minute left of class, but I guess I just want to say thank you so much. This was really helpful and great to hear from you, from your perspective. We've been reading a lot, and we've been seeing a lot, but we haven't been hearing a lot of actual Native perspectives, and it's really great to hear from you. I love Julia's little dog. She's so cute. But thank you so much for coming, and thanks for bearing with us in this difficult technological world, but I think it was great.
You're welcome.
If we have questions for you, maybe I will just ask you to indulge us a little bit more, and if students come up with questions that they didn't get to ask, I can maybe shoot you an email or give you a call, but we really appreciate your being here.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So I guess we'll say goodbye, and everybody, I will see you on Thursday. Let me know if you have questions. I see that Garrett wants me to hang around a little bit, so I will hang around. If anybody else wants to ask me questions, I'll hang around, but we'll let Loren off the hook. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care,
Stay
everybody.
well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Garrett.
Hey, Professor Dean. Quick question. I've been doing like a lot of research, and I'm finding some different things. So you were mentioning the Pennacook Abenaki. And I'm what I'm starting to like get from this is that the Abenaki are like the overall, and then
Yeah.
Pennacook is like a division of that, because
Yeah.
a lot of times when I'm Googling things, I can't find it on like the Pennacook, but like the Kawasuk band of Pennacook Abenaki. So like that's what's confusing, because there's like, it says like Pennacook Abenaki, Pennacook, but then it's
So-
like yeah.
Yeah, it's just like when we were talking about the Anishinaabe, are a big umbrella, it's the big umbrella term.
Mhm.
And it encompasses lots of individual tribes that maybe have an Anishinaabe in their name, or maybe don't, or they're the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. So if you want to just write, if it's easier to just write about the Abenaki in general, that's totally fine.
Okay.
If you can't find enough on just the tribe that's specifically associated with where you live, go bigger, think about
Okay.
your region. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I found a lot of sources through the Bryant Library about the Abenaki, just not specifically Pennacook, but
Okay,
like it talks
that's fine.
about their whole story. So okay, all right.
Yeah,
So if I can do
I thi-
that, then that'll be easier.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Sound
All
good?
right.
We
Thank
can
you.
talk about it in class on Thursday too.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
See
Bye.
ya.